The artillery observers said it couldn't be done. 900 yards with a 4-power scope in desert wind and heat shimmer that turned the air into liquid glass. The high-power scopes couldn't hold steady. The mirage made ranging impossible. But Corporal James MacKenzie wasn't using a high-power scope. He was using a vintage hunting optic that every sniper in North Africa had thrown away as obsolete. In 72 hours, he would kill 9 German artillery spotters at ranges the experts said were beyond the capability of his equipment. And he would do it so quietly that the enemy never knew where the shots were coming from. It was July 1942. The western desert of North Africa had become a killing ground where British and Commonwealth forces fought Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps in a brutal campaign of maneuver and firepower that stretched across hundreds of miles of sand and rock. The front line wasn't a line at all. It was a fluid, shifting zone where mobile columns probed for weakness and artillery dominated the battlefield. Whoever controlled the high ground controlled the guns, and whoever controlled the guns controlled the desert. James MacKenzie was 26 years old, a Scotsman from the Highlands who'd grown up stalking red deer across the hills and mountains of Inverness Shire. Before the war, he'd been a gamekeeper on a large estate, responsible for managing the deer population and guiding wealthy hunters during the season. He knew wind. He knew distance. He knew how to read terrain and predict animal movement across vast expanses of open country. When war came in 1939, he enlisted in the King's Own Scottish Borderers and was quickly identified as a natural marksman. They sent him to sniper training in late 1940, where instructors found him frustratingly unconventional but impossible to argue with because he simply didn't miss. Most snipers in the British Army were issued the Lee Enfield No. 4 MKIT, rifle equipped with a No. 32 telescopic sight, a 3.5 power scope that was rugged, reliable, and adequate for most combat situations. But MacKenzie had brought his own optic to the desert, a German-made Hensoldt dialed for by 32 scope he'd taken off a dead Wehrmacht sniper during the fighting in Greece the previous year. It was a pre-war civilian hunting scope, designed for European forests where shots rarely exceeded 300 yards and light conditions varied from deep shade to bright sun. Every other sniper who'd examined the Hensoldt had dismissed it as useless for military work. The magnification was too low for precision shooting beyond 600 yards. It lacked the reticle markings and ranging capabilities of modern military optics. The adjustment turrets were calibrated in centimeters rather than the standard minutes of angle or mil dots that military shooters used. It was a relic, a curiosity, a piece of civilian equipment that had no place on a battlefield where engagements regularly occurred at 800 to 1,000 yards. But MacKenzie saw something others didn't. He saw an optic with exceptional glass quality, the kind of optical clarity that German civilian manufacturers had perfected before the war when they were competing for the business of wealthy sportsmen who demanded perfection. He saw a wide field of view that made target acquisition faster and tracking easier. He saw a reticle that was simple and uncluttered, just a fine crosshair without the complex ranging marks that could obscure a target. And most importantly, he saw a low magnification that remained usable in conditions where high-power scopes became worthless. In the desert, heat was the enemy of precision shooting. The temperature could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit by midday, and the superheated air rising from the sand created mirage effects that made everything beyond 400 yards shimmer and dance like a hallucination. Through a high-power scope, the mirage was overwhelming, turning the target area into a liquid blur where nothing held still long enough to aim at. Experienced snipers learned to shoot early in the morning or late in the afternoon, when the air cooled and the mirage subsided. During the heat of the day, precision shooting was considered nearly impossible. But MacKenzie's 4-power Hensoldt showed him something different. The lower magnification reduced the visual impact of the mirage. Where an 8-power or 10-power scope magnified the heat shimmer and to obscure the target completely, the 4-power showed the shimmer as a gentler distortion that could be read and compensated for. MacKenzie had spent weeks in the desert studying the mirage, learning its patterns, understanding how it bent light and shifted apparent positions. He'd learned that the mirage had rhythm, a cycle of intensity that ebbed and flowed with the wind and the angle of the sun. He'd learned to wait for the moments when the shimmer calmed slightly, creating brief windows of clarity that lasted perhaps 3 or 4 seconds. He'd learned to shoot in those windows. His position overlooked a critical sector of the line near a place the maps called Hill 102, a low rise that gave observation over nearly 10 square miles of desert. The Germans had established artillery positions in defilade 5 miles to the west, big guns that could hit British positions with devastating accuracy because they had spotters on their own ridge line calling corrections. The spotters were the key to everything. Without them, the German artillery was blind, reduced to firing pre-planned barrages at coordinates that might or might not contain anything worth hitting. With them, the guns could drop shells within 10 yards of any target the spotters could see, turning every British position into a death trap. The problem was that the German spotters were good, very good. They operated from positions over 900 yards away, well beyond the effective range of British counter-sniper fire. They moved constantly, never staying in one location long enough to be targeted by artillery. They used camouflage and terrain expertly, making themselves nearly invisible against the broken rock and sand of the ridge. And they worked in teams with multiple spotters covering different sectors, ensuring that even if one was killed or driven to ground, others could continue directing fire. For 3 weeks, British forces on Hill 102 had been systematically hammered by German artillery. Casualties mounted. Morale crumbled. Units that should have been resting and refitting were instead spending every day under bombardment, scrambling between positions, watching friends die in explosions they couldn't predict or prevent. The artillery spotters were killing more men than the infantry, and nobody could figure out how to stop them. MacKenzie studied the problem for 2 days before he took his first shot. He watched the German ridge through a scope, mapping positions, tracking movement patterns, identifying the spots where spotters appeared and disappeared. He calculated distances using landmarks and the mil-dot ranging formula adapted for his scope's reticle. He studied the wind, noting how it shifted throughout the day, swirling in the heat, calming in the evening, gusting from the north just after dawn. He studied the mirage, learning its daily rhythm, understanding when it would be manageable and when it would be impossible. The German spotters appeared most frequently in the early morning, between 0600 and 0800 hours, when the light was good and the air was relatively calm. They would emerge from covered positions, set up their optics and radios, and begin calling fire missions against British targets they'd identified the previous day. They worked quickly, efficiently, professionally. They knew they were vulnerable, knew that British snipers were hunting them, but they also knew that the range was extreme and the conditions were brutal. MacKenzie chose his firing position carefully. He needed elevation to reduce the downward angle and keep his bullet trajectory as flat as possible. He needed a position that gave him a clear view of the German ridge without exposing his silhouette against the sky. He needed cover from return fire and concealment from German optics. He found a cluster of broken rocks about 40 yards back from crest of Hill 102, a natural formation that created a gap just wide enough to shoot through while remaining invisible from the front. He built his hide over 6 hours, working at night when German observation was limited. He moved rocks carefully, creating a small enclosure that would protect him from shrapnel and conceal his position from any angle except directly overhead. He arranged sandbags filled with desert sand to create a stable shooting rest. He stretched a piece of camouflage netting across the top of the position, weighting it with stones to keep it from flapping in the wind. He cut a small firing port through the netting, just large enough for his rifle barrel, and disguised the opening with loose fabric that would move in the wind like everything else. Inside the hide, he organized his equipment with meticulous care. His rifle, the Lee Enfield No. 4 with a Hensoldt scope, rested on the sandbag rest with the barrel pointing toward the German ridge. Ammunition was arranged in neat rows, sorted by lot number because he'd learned that different production runs had slightly different velocities and trajectories. His range-finding notes were written on a small card tied to his wrist. His water bottle was within reach, because dehydration would cause his hands to shake and his vision to blur. A small notebook and pencil were ready to record each shot, each observation, each piece of information that might be useful. The first German spotter appeared at 0615 hours on the third morning. MacKenzie had been in position since 0430, lying motionless in the hide, let his body settle, controlling his breathing, preparing his mind for the shot That would come. Through the Hensoldt, he watched a figure emerge from a covered position on the German ridge, moving low and fast to a spot behind a large boulder. The range was 930 yards. The wind was blowing from his left at approximately 8 miles per hour, gusting occasionally to 12. The morning air was cool, which meant his bullet would fly slightly faster and flatter than the ballistic tables predicted for desert conditions. The spotter set up his equipment, a large scissor telescope on a tripod, and a radio set with a long antenna. MacKenzie could see him clearly now, a lean figure in tropical uniform and a peaked cap, scanning the British positions through the telescope. The German was making notes, probably marking targets for the morning's fire missions. In perhaps 5 minutes, British soldiers would start dying because of what this man was seeing and reporting. MacKenzie calculated the shot in his mind, a process that had become automatic through thousands of hours of practice. Range, 930 yards. Bullet drop at that distance with a .303 British round, approximately 180 inches or 15 feet. Wind drift, approximately 48 inches right to left or 4 feet. Mirage effect, minimal at this early hour, perhaps 6 inches of apparent lateral movement. Angle, slight downward, maybe 3 degrees, which would reduce the effective range by about 15 yards and change the drop by 4 inches. He adjusted his aim, holding the crosshair high and to the right of the target, compensating for all the variables his mind had calculated. The German spotter was stationary, bent over his telescope, completely focused on the British positions, and unaware that he was being watched. MacKenzie controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate, waiting for the moment between heartbeats when his body was most still. The wind gusted, then calmed. The mirage settled for a moment. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle recoiled against his shoulder with familiar pressure. Through the scope, he watched the German spotter jerk backward and collapse behind the boulder, the telescope tipping over as the man fell. The sound of the shot reached the German ridge a full second after the bullet impact, a faint crack that echoed across the desert and could have come from anywhere within 1,000 yards. MacKenzie worked the bolt smoothly, ejecting the spent case and chambering a fresh round, but he didn't fire again. One shot, one kill, no follow-up that would give away his position. The German reaction was confused and slow. Other spotters didn't know what had happened. They knew one of their men was down, but they didn't know if it was sniper fire, a random artillery round, or heat exhaustion. The distance was so extreme that the idea of accurate rifle fire seemed impossible. They took basic precautions, moving to cover positions, scanning for threats, but they didn't withdraw. They couldn't afford to. The artillery missions had to continue. 40 minutes later, a second spotter appeared in a different location, 600 yards south of the first position. MacKenzie had already mapped this spot, had already calculated the range at 880 yards. The wind had picked up slightly, now blowing steady at 10 miles per hour. The sun was higher, and the first heat shimmer was beginning to distort the air. Through the 4-power Hensoldt, the mirage was visible but manageable, a gentle wavering that MacKenzie had learned to read. The second spotter was more cautious than the first. He moved in short rushes, staying low, using every bit of cover available. He set up behind a low wall of rocks, only his head and shoulders visible as he raised his binoculars to scan the British lines. MacKenzie waited. Patience was the sniper's greatest weapon, more valuable than accuracy or equipment. He waited for the spotter to settle, to focus on his work, to forget for just a moment that death might be watching from across 900 yards of empty desert. The moment came. The spotter leaned forward slightly to adjust his binoculars, and for perhaps 3 seconds, his upper body was fully exposed. MacKenzie had already calculated the shot, had already adjusted for the slightly shorter range and the increased wind. He held the crosshair high and right, waited for the brief calm between gusts, and fired. The German spotter dropped out of sight behind the rocks. MacKenzie couldn't confirm the kill through the scope, but the way the man fell, sudden and loose, told him everything he needed to know. Now the Germans knew something was wrong. 2 spotters down in less than an hour, both at extreme range, both killed by shots that seemed to come from nowhere. The artillery missions stopped while they tried to figure out what was happening. Officers scanned the British ridge with powerful optics, looking for muzzle flash or the glint of a scope lens. They saw nothing. Mackenzie's position was too far back from the crest, too well concealed, and his low-power scope didn't produce the bright reflection that higher magnification optics created. The third kill came 2 hours later, after the Germans had convinced themselves that the first 2 deaths might have been accidents or lucky shots. A new spotter appeared at a third location, this one even farther south, attempting to observe from a position the British supposedly couldn't reach with rifle fire. Range, 970 yards. This was beyond what most military snipers would attempt, beyond what the doctrine said was possible with a standard Lee Enfield, beyond what anyone expected in desert conditions with heat, mirage, and wind. But Mackenzie had been shooting at deer at similar ranges in the Scottish Highlands for 15 years before the war. He'd learned on his father's estate that long-range shooting wasn't about the power of your scope or the sophistication of your reticle. It was about understanding ballistics, reading conditions, and having the patience to wait for the perfect moment. The 4-power Hensoldt gave him enough magnification to see his target clearly, while keeping the field of view wide enough to read the mirage and track wind patterns across the entire area. The heat shimmer was worse now, mid-morning sun turning the desert air into a furnace. Through a high-power scope, the target area would have been a blurred, writhing mass of distortion. Through the Hensoldt, Mackenzie could see the shimmer as waves of movement, like looking through water. He'd learned to time the waves, to shoot in the brief moments when they calmed, when the air settled for just an instant before the next wave of heat rose from the sand. He watched through the scope, waiting. The German spotter was careful, staying mostly behind cover, only occasionally exposing himself to make observations. Mackenzie waited. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. 15. His body was perfectly still, his breathing slow and controlled, his mind calm and focused. This was what separated good snipers from great ones. Not the spectacular shot made under pressure, but the ability to wait in absolute stillness for hours if necessary, to let opportunity come rather than forcing it. The spotter made a mistake. He raised his binoculars to scan the British positions, and for a moment, he forgot his discipline. He leaned out slightly from behind his cover, exposing his head and chest, focusing on what he was seeing through the optics rather than on his own vulnerability. The mirage calmed. The wind dropped to perhaps 6 miles per hour. Mackenzie adjusted his hold, compensating for the extreme range and environmental conditions. He fired. The bullet took nearly 2 full seconds to reach the target, traveling at over 2,000 feet per second at the muzzle, but slowing gradually as it fought through air resistance and gravity. Mackenzie watched through the scope as the German spotter jerked backward and disappeared behind the rocks. The sound of the shot arrived at the German ridge 3 seconds after impact, a rolling crack that echoed off the desert floor and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The German response was immediate and aggressive. They knew now that they had a serious problem. Someone on the British ridge was systematically killing their artillery spotters at ranges that shouldn't be possible. They brought up their own snipers, experienced men with quality rifles and high-power scopes, and began a methodical search of the British positions. They fired ranging shots at suspected sniper hides, trying to provoke return fire that would give away a position. They moved observers to new locations, trying to find an angle that would let them spot the British shooter. Mackenzie remained invisible. His hide was positioned perfectly, concealed not just in the front, but from the flanks and overhead. The camouflage netting broke up his outline. The firing port was small enough that even a direct hit nearby wouldn't reveal the position. And most importantly, he was firing from a range and position that the Germans had calculated was impossible for effective counter-sniper work. They were looking for him at 600 to 700 yards, the normal maximum engagement range. They weren't looking at 900 yards, because no one expected accurate fire from that distance in desert conditions. The killing continued over the next 2 days. Mackenzie worked with methodical precision, never taking more than 2 shots in a morning, never firing from exactly the same position to hide, always waiting for the perfect confluence of conditions before pressing the trigger. He killed the 4th spotter late in the afternoon of the first day, a long shot at 950 yards through heat mirage that made the target shimmer like a ghost. He killed the 5th spotter at dawn the following morning, catching the man during the brief window, when he thought it was safe to set up his observation post. Each kill changed the tactical situation slightly. German artillery became less effective, less accurate, less able to respond quickly to developing situations. British units that had been pinned down by precise artillery fire found they could move more freely, could conduct operations without the certainty that German shells would land on top of them within minutes. The balance of power in this sector was shifting, and it was shifting because one man with an obsolete hunting scope was doing what everyone said was impossible. The 6th and 7th kills came on the second day. The Germans were desperate now, rotating fresh spotters into the line, try and maintain their artillery effectiveness despite the losses. They'd brought in more protection, assigned infantry squads to guard the observation posts, increased camouflage efforts. But they couldn't make the spotters invisible, and they couldn't reduce the range that made MacKenzie's position so safe. As long as he remained patient and disciplined, as long as he waited for the perfect shots rather than taking marginal ones, he was untouchable. The 6th spotter died at 0730 hours, killed by a shot at 910 yards that caught him while he was setting up his equipment. The 7th died 3 hours later, a longer shot at 980 yards that MacKenzie had spent 40 minutes preparing for, waiting for the exact moment when wind and mirage and target exposure all aligned. Both men fell without ever knowing where the shots came from, without ever seeing the threat that killed them. By the evening of the second day, the German artillery spotting network in this sector had collapsed. The surviving spotters were terrified, refusing to expose themselves long enough to conduct effective observation. The big guns fell silent, unable to engage targets they couldn't see, unwilling to waste ammunition on speculative fire at empty coordinates. The German command knew they had a serious problem, but they couldn't solve it. They couldn't find the British sniper, couldn't suppress him, couldn't force him out of his position. The 8th kill came at dawn on the third day, and it was perhaps the most important of all. German headquarters had sent a senior artillery officer forward to assess the situation and restore the spotting network. The officer was experienced and capable, a major who directed artillery fire across North Africa for 18 months. He came forward with confidence, certain that the British sniper was a temporary problem that could be solved with proper tactics and discipline. MacKenzie watched him arrive through the Hensoldt. The major was easy to identify, moving between positions of authority, organizing the remaining spotters, setting up a new observation post that he clearly believed was positioned beyond the reach of British fire. Range, 1,020 yards. This was the longest shot MacKenzie had attempted in combat, beyond even what he'd regularly practiced in the Highlands. But the conditions were as good as they would get. Dawn air was cool and calm. The wind was light and steady from the left. The mirage was minimal. The major set up behind a substantial rock formation, confident in his cover, and began scanning the British positions with a powerful telescope. MacKenzie took his time. He calculated the bullet drop at over 1,000 yards, more than 200 inches, nearly 17 feet. He calculated the wind drift, perhaps 5 feet at this range. He adjusted for the slight downward angle, for the cooler air temperature, for every variable he'd learned to account for over years of long-range shooting. He held the crosshairs so high and to the right that the target was barely visible at the bottom left edge of the scope's field of view. This was shooting by calculation more than by sight, trusting the mathematics and the ballistics and the thousands of hours of experience that told him where the bullet would go. He steadied his breathing, calmed his heart, and fired. The bullet arced across more than 1,000 yards of desert air, rising and then falling in a long parabolic curve of extreme-range ballistics. MacKenzie watched through the scope, seeing nothing but the general area where the major had been positioned. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened. Then he saw movement, figures rushing toward the rock formation, men shouting and gesturing. The major was down. The 9th and final kill came that afternoon, under the worst possible conditions. The heat was intense, the mirage was severe, and the wind was gusting unpredictably between 8 and 15 miles per hour. A German spotter, either brave or foolish, had taken up position at 940 yards, apparently believing that the mid-afternoon conditions made accurate fire impossible. He was partially right. Under these conditions, with this level of heat, shimmer, and wind, a high-power scope would have been useless. The magnification would have turned the target area into an incomprehensible blur of distortion. But the 4-power Hensoldt still showed MacKenzie what he needed to see. The mirage was bad, but it was readable. The heat waves rose and fell in visible patterns. Between the waves, there were moments of relative clarity, perhaps 1 second out of every 10 when the air settled just enough to show the target's true position. MacKenzie watched for 20 minutes, studying the pattern, learning the rhythm of this particular afternoon's conditions. Then he waited for the moment. It came without warning. A brief lull in the heat shimmer that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. The German spotter was visible, clear enough to aim at, exposed while making an observation. MacKenzie had already calculated the shot, had already adjusted for the challenging conditions. He held high and right, compensating for the wind and distance and the heat that would affect his bullet's flight. He fired between heartbeats, in the instant when his body was most still. The spotter fell. MacKenzie worked the bolt and immediately withdrew from his firing position. Moving low and fast to the secondary hide, he prepared 50 yards away. He knew this shot would draw attention, knew the Germans would finally realize the approximate position he'd been shooting from. But it didn't matter anymore. 9 artillery spotters dead in 72 hours. The German observation network in this sector was destroyed, and it would take weeks to rebuild it with men willing to accept the assignment. The artillery fell silent. British forces on Hill 102 spent the next 4 days in relative peace, able to move, to resupply, to conduct operations without the constant threat of precision artillery fire. Casualties dropped by over 60%. Morale improved dramatically. The tactical balance in this sector of the desert shifted in favor of the Commonwealth forces, not because of a major battle or a brilliant maneuver, but because one sniper with an obsolete scope had eliminated the enemy's ability to direct their most powerful weapons. MacKenzie never spoke about the 9 kills in detail, not to his fellow soldiers, not to his officers, not to the military historians who interviewed him after the war. When asked about his success, he would say only that he'd used equipment that suited the conditions and that he'd taken the time to understand the environment. He never claimed the shots were particularly difficult, never suggested he'd done anything extraordinary. To him, it was simply applied fieldcraft, the same skills he'd learned stalking deer in the highlands translated to a military context. After the North African campaign, MacKenzie continued to serve as a sniper through Sicily, Italy, and eventually northwestern Europe. He survived the war, returned to Scotland in 1946, and went back to work as a gamekeeper on the same estate where he'd learned to shoot as a boy. He kept a Hensoldt scope, though he returned the military rifle. He mounted the scope on a sporting rifle and used it for deer stalking for another 30 years, until his eyesight began to fail, and he retired from active field work in the mid-1970s. He died in 1989 at the age of 73. His family donated his equipment to a small military museum in Inverness, where it sits today in a modest display about Scottish snipers in the Second World War. The Hensoldt scope is there, mounted on a replica rifle, accompanied by a brief description of MacKenzie's service and a faded photograph of a lean, weather-beaten man with steady eyes and a hint of a smile. Most visitors spend perhaps 30 seconds at the display before moving on. The scope looks unremarkable, just an old piece of optical equipment that seems primitive compared to modern military optics with their sophisticated reticles and ranging systems and illuminated displays. There's nothing obviously special about it, nothing that would suggest it changed the outcome of battles or killed men at ranges most experts said were impossible. But the lesson isn't in the equipment itself. It's in what the equipment represents. MacKenzie succeeded with a low-power hunting scope, not because it was better than military optics in any objective sense, but because it was better suited to the specific conditions he faced. The high-power scopes that other snipers relied on were optimized for ideal conditions. Good light, minimal mirage, moderate ranges. They worked beautifully when conditions were perfect, but when conditions deteriorated, when heat shimmer made everything beyond 400 yards look like a hallucination, the high-power scopes became liabilities rather than assets. MacKenzie understood something fundamental about tools and technology that most people miss. He understood that more power, more magnification, more sophistication doesn't automatically mean better performance. Sometimes the simpler tool, the less powerful option, The equipment that seems obsolete or inadequate is actually the superior choice because it matches the requirements of the situation rather than exceeding them in ways that create new problems. The 4-power scope gave him just enough magnification to identify and engage targets at extreme range while maintaining a wide enough field of view to read environmental conditions across the entire target area. The simple crosshair reticle was fast and uncluttered, allowing him to acquire targets quickly without having to interpret complex ranging marks through heat shimmer. The lower magnification reduced the visual impact of mirage, making it possible to shoot during conditions when high-power scopes would have been useless. Every apparent limitation of the equipment turned out to be an advantage in the specific environment where MacKenzie operated. This principle extends far beyond optics and shooting. In every field, in every context, there's a persistent assumption that more capability equals better results. More power, more speed, more features, more complexity. We build tools and systems that maximize capability under ideal conditions. And then we're surprised when they perform poorly or fail completely when conditions deteriorate. We forget that reliability under adverse conditions is often more valuable than peak performance under perfect ones. MacKenzie's 9 kills at extreme range weren't about having the best equipment. They were about having the right equipment for the specific conditions he faced. They were about understanding the environment deeply enough to know which capabilities mattered and which didn't. They were about the patience and discipline to work within the limitations of his tools rather than fighting against them or wishing for something different. In the middle of a brutal desert campaign, where survival often depended on having the newest weapons and the most advanced technology, MacKenzie succeeded with a pre-war hunting scope that his peers had dismissed as inadequate. He succeeded because he'd taken the time to understand what he actually needed rather than accepting what conventional wisdom said he should want. He succeeded because he'd learned to read conditions that made other men's superior equipment worthless. He succeeded because he developed the skill and patience to extract maximum performance from simple tools that worked reliably when more sophisticated options failed. The Germans never figured out what had happened. After the war, intelligence officers who studied the incident couldn't understand how a British sniper had consistently made kills at ranges beyond 900 yards in desert conditions with heat shimmer and wind. The ranges seemed impossible. The conditions seemed prohibitive. Their analysis concluded that either the range estimates were wrong or that the British had deployed some new secret weapon, possibly a specialized long-range rifle with advanced optics that Allied forces had kept hidden from observation. They never considered that the answer might be simpler than they imagined, that it might be a gamekeeper from the Scottish Highlands using a 4-power hunting scope, because he understood that sometimes less magnification means better visibility, that it might be patience and fieldcraft and the willingness to wait hours for a 3-second window of opportunity, that it might be the quiet confidence of a man who knew his equipment and his environment well enough to ignore what the experts said was impossible. In a world that constantly pushes toward more complexity, more capability, more technological sophistication, MacKenzie's story is a reminder that success often comes from choosing the right tool for the specific job rather than the most powerful tool available. It comes from understanding your environment well enough to know which capabilities will actually matter under real-world conditions. It comes from the discipline to master simple, reliable equipment rather than constantly seeking the next upgrade or the latest advancement. The 9 German artillery spotters died at extreme range not because they faced overwhelming firepower or superior technology. They died because one man with an obsolete scope understood his environment better than they understood theirs, and because he had the patience and skill to work within his limitations rather than being limited by them. That understanding, that patience, that skill made all the difference between impossible and inevitable. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold stories from history. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments.